Welcome to the channel. Today we are going to examine one of the most consequential ruptures in modern Western history. A rupture that has been unfolding in real time since February 28th, 2026, the day the United States and Israel launched their surprise attack on Iran. Because what has happened in the weeks and months since that day is not simply a military conflict in the Middle East. It is also a political earthquake at the very heart of the Western alliance. A moment when America's closest European partners, for the first time in the post-World War II era, not only refused to join an American military campaign, but actively blocked it. Spain closed its military bases and airspace to American warplanes. Italy denied landing rights to U.S. military aircraft at its critical Sigonella base in Sicily. France blocked flights carrying American military supplies from transiting French airspace. Austria closed its airspace. Germany declared the war had nothing to do with NATO. And Britain, America's most loyal transatlantic partner, announced that whatever the pressure, it would not be dragged into this war. These are not minor diplomatic hesitations. These are sovereign decisions by America's closest allies to place themselves in direct opposition to an American military operation and to accept the diplomatic consequences of doing so. In today's episode, we are going to examine exactly why that happened, because the answer is not simple, and it is not just about Iran. It is about a fundamental breakdown in the logic of the Western alliance that has been building for years and has now reached a point of visible, documented, and potentially permanent fracture. Stay with us. The first reason, Europe was never consulted, and that changes everything. To understand why European nations have refused to support the US-Israel campaign against Iran, you have to begin with a fact that is both simple and extraordinary. None of them were consulted before the bombs fell. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched a coordinated surprise attack on Iran, assassinating its supreme leader, striking military and nuclear infrastructure, and initiating the largest American military operation in the Middle East since the 2003 invasion of Iraq. Not a single European NATO ally was informed in advance. Not France, not Germany, not Britain, not Italy, not any of them. According to a report by Politico, Trump made his decision to strike Iran without prior coordination with European allies, and according to an unnamed senior European official, Trump appeared determined to act unilaterally and did not consider collective defense a core principle of NATO. This is the foundational grievance from which everything else flows. Under NATO's foundational principles, the alliance is built on habits of consultation, shared decision-making, and the basic expectation that allies inform one another before going to war. Those habits were not just bypassed, they were publicly and visibly discarded. As Ivo Dalder, a former US ambassador to NATO, told CNN, there was a way to bring NATO allies into the discussion and have a discussion about how to increase pressure on Iran. The president decided to do none of that. He decided to start a war without talking to Congress, without talking to the American people, and without talking to the allies. European leaders were left to watch the opening strikes on their television screens like ordinary members of the public. And then, within hours, they were expected to provide military bases, airspace access, and political support for a war they had no role in designing, no stake in initiating, and no agreed objective in pursuing. The near-universal European answer to that expectation was the same: no. The second reason, under international law, Europe considers this war illegal. Beyond the procedural failure of consultation lies a deeper and more principled objection: the conviction, shared across the majority of European governments and European legal institutions, that the US-Israel attack on Iran was not lawful under international law. European leaders, from Germany to Spain, have been explicit about this. Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez was among the first and most vocal, declaring the war profoundly illegal and profoundly unjust. Spain's Defense Minister Margarita Robles stated directly that the war is not a war of self-defense, because there was no evidence of an imminent attack by Iran against the United States or Israel. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz's spokesman stated that the conflict has nothing to do with NATO. The Egmont Institute's director, Sven Biskop, said European leaders are quite adamant about not being pulled into what they see as a war that NATO was never consulted on. The underlying legal argument is straightforward and powerful. NATO's core obligation, enshrined in Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty, is collective self-defense. If one member is attacked, the others come to its defense. But the United States was not attacked on February 28, 2026. The United States launched the first strike, a surprise attack on a country that was, at that moment, engaged in diplomatic negotiations with Washington. Multiple experts in international law and international criminal law have identified the attack as a war of aggression under the definitions established by international criminal law, the same category of offense for which leaders were prosecuted at Nuremberg after World War II. European political leaders have made the calculation that joining or supporting a war of choice disguised as self-defense, one that was not sanctioned by the UN Security Council and that their own legal experts consider illegal, would expose their governments to enormous domestic political liability, international reputational damage, and potentially legal accountability. That is not a risk any democratically elected European government is willing to assume for a war it had no part in deciding. The third reason, the energy crisis, is landing directly on European citizens. If the legal and procedural objections explain why European governments are philosophically opposed to the Iran war, the energy crisis explains why they are politically unable to support it regardless of their philosophical views. The day before the US-Israel attack on February 28, 2026, natural gas in Europe was trading at approximately 31.9 euros per megawatt hour at the Tidal Transfer Facility, Europe's benchmark gas trading hub. Within days of the strike's beginning, that price had nearly doubled, closing at 54.3 euros per megawatt hour and continuing to climb towards 63 euros at certain points. Oil prices surged toward $120 a barrel, and the proximate cause of this spike was not abstract. It was Iran's closure of the Strait of Hormuz and Iran's retaliatory strikes on Qatari liquefied natural gas facilities, which knocked out a significant share of the global LNG supply that Europe had spent years developing as an alternative to Russian pipeline gas. For European governments, this is not a foreign policy problem. It is a domestic political crisis with immediate visible consequences for their citizens. The 2022 energy crisis caused by Russia's invasion of Ukraine nearly tore the European Union apart economically. Eurozone inflation reached a record 9%. Household energy bills surged to unmanageable levels. Governments spent hundreds of billions of euros on emergency subsidies to prevent social collapse. That crisis was triggered by a war that Europe had nothing to do with starting, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Now Europe is being asked to support and enable a second war that has triggered a second comparable energy crisis, a war that America chose to start without consulting any of its European allies. As Bloomberg observed, for America's European allies, the Iran war started as a human emergency and a geopolitical test for governments reluctant to be dragged into a mess they never asked for, and it has turned into an energy shock with echoes of the 2022 Ukraine war. The Atlantic Council documented that the closure of Qatari LNG production and the Strait of Hormuz together tightened global LNG markets in ways that threatened Europe's ability to refill its gas storage reserves for the coming winter. Storage that was already at historically low levels of approximately 30% capacity following a harsh 2025 to 2026 winter. No European prime minister, chancellor, or president can tell their citizens that they are supporting a war that is directly causing their heating bills to double and threatening energy supply for the coming winter. The domestic political cost is simply prohibitive. The fourth reason, Europe is already carrying the burden of Ukraine. America is walking away. The fourth major reason for European refusal to support the Iran war cannot be understood without the context of what Europe has been asked to do in Ukraine and what America has done in response. Since Russia's invasion of Ukraine Ukraine in February 2022, Europe has been the primary sustained supporter of Ukrainian defense. European countries have provided weapons, ammunition, financial support, and humanitarian assistance to Ukraine in amounts that have stretched their defense budgets and political systems to extraordinary levels. Throughout this period, European leaders operated on the understanding that the US-European NATO alliance was a partnership, that America would remain committed to European security in exchange for European support of American-led global order. What has happened since Trump returned to the White House has fundamentally undermined that understanding. Trump has threatened to withdraw the United States from NATO. He has imposed punitive tariffs on European exports. He has made threats about Greenland and the Panama Canal. He has repeatedly described NATO as a bad deal for America and European allies as free riders. And most critically, he has reduced American support for Ukraine at precisely the moment when that support was most needed, effectively signaling to European governments that if they are attacked, they cannot count on automatic American support. European leaders are now confronting a deeply uncomfortable logic. They are being asked by the same American president who has questioned whether he would defend them under Article 5 to provide military support, airspace access, and political backing for an American war of choice in the Middle East. As the Washington Monthly observed, even leaders like Britain's Starmer, Germany's Merz, France's Macron, and Italy's Meloni, who have tried to maintain the American relationship through years of Trump's provocations, are losing patience. Europe is beginning to prepare for a new, less dependent relationship with the United States, and refusing to be dragged into the Iran war is one of the first and most visible expressions of that new reality. The fifth reason: the fear of Iranian retaliation on European soil. There is another dimension to European refusal that receives less public attention, but that is very much present in the classified threat assessments being studied by European governments: the real and documented risk of Iranian retaliation against European targets. Iran's threat network in Europe is not a hypothetical construct. Security analyses have documented that Hezbollah-affiliated assets in Europe and North America retain operational capacity to target Jewish, Israeli, and U.S. government-linked individuals on European soil. Iran has demonstrated repeatedly and over decades its willingness to conduct intelligence operations and proxy attacks in European countries. Assassinations, bombings, and cyber attacks that have occurred in Germany, France, Britain, and elsewhere. An Iranian drone struck a British Royal Air Force base in Cyprus within days of the US-Israel attack beginning, a direct demonstration that Iran was both willing and capable of striking European assets in retaliation for actions it attributed to the Western alliance. For European governments, joining the Iran war operationally, allowing American bombers to fly from their bases, providing naval vessels to the Strait of Hormuz, or otherwise becoming visible participants in the campaign, would transform their countries from bystanders into legitimate targets in Iranian strategic calculations. The risk of Iranian-backed attacks on European cities, European infrastructure, or European military personnel is not an abstract concern that can be dismissed by politicians. It is a documented, assessed, concrete risk that security services across Europe have presented to their political leaders. And those leaders have concluded that the benefit of supporting an American war of choice does not justify exposing their citizens to that risk. The sixth reason: the strategic damage to America's global credibility concerns Europe too. The sixth and perhaps most analytically sophisticated reason for European hesitation is one that European governments have not stated publicly, but that is visible in their internal strategic assessments and in the analysis of think tanks across the continent. The concern that supporting the Iran war actively damages Western credibility and global standing in ways that harm European long-term interests. For years, Europe and the United States jointly led a rules-based international order built on the principles of national sovereignty, prohibition of wars of aggression, respect for international law, and the authority of multilateral institutions. That order was Europe's primary source of international influence. It was the framework that allowed relatively smaller European powers to punch above their weight in global affairs. The American war on Iran, launched without UN Security Council authorization, without congressional approval, and while diplomatic negotiations were actively ongoing, has dealt a massive blow to that rules-based order. As analysts at GlobSec noted, the underlying damage to habits of consultation, to assumptions of shared purpose, and to the basic expectation that allies inform one another before going to war is real and will not dissolve once the immediate crisis passes. European leaders understand that a world in which the most powerful country can launch surprise attacks on nations during active negotiations, bypass every multilateral institution, and then demand allied support for the consequences is a world in which Europe's own security and sovereignty are fundamentally more vulnerable. Joining and legitimizing that model would undermine the very framework that protects European interests globally. The consequences: a transatlantic alliance that may never fully recover. The accumulated weight of all these reasons has produced something that most analysts of NATO and transatlantic relations did not believe they would witness in their lifetimes: a visible, documented, and apparently durable fracture between the United States and its closest European allies. Spain closed the jointly operated Rota and Moron military bases to American operations related to Iran, withdrew its ambassador to Israel, and closed its airspace. Italy denied landing rights at Sigonella, a critical facility that hosts advanced maritime patrol aircraft and drone systems. France blocked U.S. military supply flights from transiting French airspace, a first since the war began. Austria denied airspace access. Germany declared the conflict had nothing to do with NATO. And Britain, while ultimately allowing some American aircraft to operate from RAF Fairford, refused to join the war itself, with Prime Minister Keir Starmer saying explicitly that whatever the pressure, Britain would not be dragged into this conflict. Trump responded by calling NATO a paper tiger and suggesting he was considering withdrawing the United States from the alliance entirely. He told Reuters, "They haven't been friends when we needed them. It's a one-way street." But Europeans have seen this dynamic very differently. As the Christian Science Monitor reported, for their part, Europeans say they are not wavering from their decision not to get involved in a war they believe was not necessary, that they were not consulted on, and which has triggered an avoidable global economic crisis. The Carnegie Endowment for International Peace put it with unusual directness. The United States has gone to war with Iran without consulting Europe. Trump did not consult his European and NATO allies before launching the war, but now he is demanding they take responsibility for returning things to how they were before. As a former U.S. ambassador to NATO told CNN, military alliances are at their core based on trust, the confidence that if I am attacked, you will come to help defend me. It is hard to see how any European country will now be able and willing to trust the United States to come to its defense. What do we understand from all of this? The European refusal to support the American war on Iran is not, at its core, about Iran. It is the product of 6 converging reasons that together made support politically impossible, legally indefensible, economically catastrophic, and strategically counterproductive for every major European government. Europe was not consulted before a war was started in its name. Europe considers that war illegal under international law, and its legal experts have said so publicly. Europe is paying a direct and immediate economic price for the war through energy costs that land on ordinary European citizens. Europe is simultaneously being asked to carry the burden of Ukraine's defense while America reduces its commitment. Europe faces documented risks of Iranian retaliation on its own soil if it participates. And Europe recognizes that supporting a war of choice undermines the rules-based international order that is the foundation of European global influence. The result is what GlobSec's analysts described as the Hormuz standoff, deepening fractures in the alliance considerably. Fractures that the alliance will survive in institutional form, but from which it will emerge with fundamentally different cohesion, credibility, and capacity for collective action. Europe is not walking away from the United States, but it is, for the first time in the post-World War II era, drawing a clear and public line between what it will and will not do in support of American foreign policy choices made without its consent. That line, once drawn in this this way does not simply disappear when the current crisis passes. We are witnessing in real time the beginning of a new and more transactional transatlantic relationship. One in which the automatic solidarity that defined Western alliance politics for 8 decades is being replaced by something more conditional, more interest-based, and more contested. Understanding that shift is essential to understanding the world that will exist when this conflict eventually ends. If you found this analysis valuable, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Let us know in the comments, do you think the transatlantic alliance can fully recover from this fracture, or has a permanent line been crossed? In our next episode, we will examine how China and Russia are positioning themselves to benefit from the divisions opening up within the Western world. Thank you for watching.